Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of popular culture in the Great Depression. And in this lecture, we move to a discussion of the golden age of Hollywood and movies during the Depression. Movies provided Americans with a sense of escape from their day-to-day lives. Not only were they fascinated with the medium itself, how is it possible to create something like a Hollywood film? But also the storylines, the beautiful actors and actresses, and the adventure that was shown on the screens gave Americans a sort of excitement that they could only dream about in their day-to-day lives. The 1930s truly were the golden age of Hollywood. This is the last decade or so before the advent of television, which would bring many changes to the Hollywood movie industry. And while the Depression certainly played a toll, and the worst of it during the late 20s and into the early 30s, but Hollywood producers, directors, and actors quickly adapted and began to capitalize on the magic that only the big screen could provide. During this decade, there were a number of technological developments and groundbreaking performers and films. One groundbreaking film from early in the decade is Hell's Angels, released in 1930 by the iconoclast Howard Hughes. This film took more than 3 years to make, and the film process was surrounded by controversy. It was a World War I epic and included a number of dramatic aerial fight scenes. Some of the stunt pilots involved in the filming had died during the process. But over the course of time when the movie was shot, the film industry moved from silent films to talkies and moved from black and white films to color. And so this film in its final rendition included some silent aspects and some with sound and music, and some black and white, and some full color sequences. So it was considered a very groundbreaking film for a lot of its methods and its sort of unique final rendition. The era also created some of Hollywood's most popular and enduring stars of all time, such as Clark Gable, Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, Errol Flynn, Humphrey Bogart, Shirley Temple, and others. It also created some of the first sex symbols in our nation's history, like Greta Garbo and Marlene Dietrich, who seemingly in every role had to find some excuse to shed some of her clothing. And so many Americans of this era and any era consider the stars of the 1930s some of Hollywood's all-time greats. By the late 1920s, movies were transitioning from silent films to talkies. The transition was sometimes rocky, and folks of that era who recall going to the movies remember that at times the sound didn't quite line up with the action on the screen, or sometimes didn't work at all. Similarly, actors and writers had to make the adjustment to movies that were now filled with sound and dialogue. Some actors were unsuccessful in making the transition from silent films to talkies, and others found their careers made by the luscious sounds of their voice. Writers as well sometimes found it difficult to successfully write dialogue. And some scholars believe this in part attributes the popularity of musicals during that era, because writers who were kind of stumped could always throw in a musical number or a dance to fill in some of the time when the dialogue itself got too tricky. But the advent of sound in movies certainly created the possibility for more ambitious films to be made, and as the decade went on, films certainly grew more and more grandiose in their aims. Some of the popular genres of the era included gangster films, musicals, comedies, and monster movies, and we'll talk about some of these in a little bit more detail in just a moment. But among the popular genres were full-screen, enormous adventure epics, including the Tarzan series, which was very popular during this time. The star of many of those Tarzan movies was Johnny Weissmuller, one of the world's great swimmers in the 1920s. He won 5 Olympic gold medals for swimming and 1 bronze medal for water polo. But he was most famous for playing Tarzan, a role that he reprised a dozen times or more, earning more than $2 million and going down in film history as one of film's first great sex symbols. On the flip side of that was the most successful and famous actress of the 30s, the child star Shirley Temple. She starred in more than 40 films during the 1930s, beginning her career at the age of 3, when she starred in a historically controversial series called Baby Burlesques, in which young children were dressed up and portrayed in adult situations. From that sort of controversial beginning, her career blossomed in the mid-1930s as her talents, not only as a cute child star, but also a legitimate singer and dancer, along with other talents, became widely known and celebrated. She was especially known for her tap dancing routines in movies like The Little Colonel and The Littlest Rebel. By the mid-1930s, Shirley Temple had become an industry unto her own right. There was a line of girls' dresses to go along with it, hair bows, the soundtracks from her movies sold millions of copies, and all kinds of other memorabilia to accompany her films. It would be an overstatement to say that her film career didn't last beyond her childhood performances, but her later career was not as successful as those childhood films, and she retired from motion pictures in 1949, although she did make a few more films in the 50s and 60s. Later in life, she became engaged in politics and actually served as an ambassador to several foreign nations for a time in the 70s and 80s. Among the other top performers of that age were the Marx Brothers, whose brand of slapstick and physical comedy, combined with its fast-moving and spirited banter, were perfectly suited to this early era of Hollywood films. And animated features, created by the Walt Disney Studios, also flourished during this time. Snow White became America's first full-length animated movie in 1937, and in other ways animated films were groundbreaking and pushed the boundaries of what were known as filmmaking limits at that time. Some of the first full-color features of that era, for instance, were created by Walt Disney. By the end of the decade, the industry had come far enough to create some of Hollywood's biggest all-time blockbuster films, including The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind, both released in 1939. While The Wizard of Oz is a beloved American classic, Gone with the Wind is a much more important critical achievement, and one that warrants a little bit more discussion, as it stands as perhaps the most important and memorable film of the 1930s. It was based on the novel by Margaret Mitchell, which had been released in 1936, and was groundbreaking in its own right. That novel sold more than 176,000 copies in its first week, and was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1937. The producer David Selznick bought the rights to the novel within a month after its publication, and then set about over the next 3 years to produce one of the greatest blockbuster films in American history. As is the case with many blockbusters, the filming process was rocky. 5 different directors and 13 writers toiled over 3 years to make the film possible. And some of the scenes, such as the burning of Atlanta, required massive technical challenges, unlike any other film had hurdled up to that point. The final film, released in 1939, was the most expensive film made up to that point and the longest ever put to the screen, running almost 4 hours long and including an intermission. The film was a monster success. It was ultimately nominated for 13 Oscar awards and won 8, including the first ever for an African American actor or actress, for Hattie McDaniel, who played Mammy in the film. The film, of course, is an epic of the Civil War and Reconstruction era in American history. And certainly scholars have taken their turn at picking apart elements of the historical accuracy of the film. It is controversial in a number of different ways, one of which is the depiction of the main character, Scarlett O'Hara, who really comes across as a strong, independent woman of the 1930s, more than a historically accurate depiction of a woman of the Civil War era. And more controversial still was the question of race and the way the black actors and their characters were depicted in the film itself, and also in the aftermath when the film was released in the American South. The fact that the black performers were not allowed at the premiere presentation of the film is just one of the many controversies surrounding race and Gone with the Wind. Controversy aside, the film remains one of the top grossing films in all of American history and stood for more than 30 years at number one on that list. And it remains an important historical and film landmark of that era.